discriminates against people who are working class and working poor in ways that make them less likely to get married. So again, going to college, getting married, and staying married to somebody who's also college educated and stable, well-paying jobs with benefits. Those three things come together typically to create the stability and the sort of keeping and maintaining of middle class life and status. Middle class people can get their basic needs met without government assistance overwhelmingly. There may be times, of course, that are tighter where they're pinched, where somebody might experience within the household or the family a downsizing or a layoff. But again, this is not likely to be a permanent condition because middle class people, again, have so much invested in themselves, particularly in terms of higher education. If you're middle class, you are likely at some point to own a home or perhaps own a few homes during your lifetime, not necessarily together, but with the exception, of course, of members of the upper middle class, and we'll talk about them as well. Overwhelmingly, middle class people are professionals, and so they're professionals who work in the business world. They work in higher education and education, the public sector and government, real estate, skilled trades, law, as well as social services. Right? So a wide range of occupational categories and classifications are made up of people who are middle class. Now, within the middle class, you've got levels too, just like you have amongst the wealthy. And so the top of the middle class is referred to as the upper middle class. And so these are the most educated professional and consequently the highest earning households in the middle class. And so these folks generally have graduate and professional degrees, graduate and or professional degrees, I should say, or they have a very highly specialized degree at the bachelor's level or at the two-year level as well. So you're looking typically at household incomes that are significantly greater than $100,000 per year, and again that may be in the 200s if we're looking at again those more expensive geographies like Connecticut, New Jersey, California, and New York. So the majority of these overwhelmingly upper middle class households, the majority of them are married couples who own their own homes, and they have the ability to invest. So they may be able to buy over time other properties, invest in stocks and bonds. They will be able to accumulate and develop some significant wealth and maintain it in a way similar to what you see amongst the upper class, but of course it'll be substantially much smaller. When the upper middle class, obviously when we're looking at them working, they enjoy generous benefit packages, paid time off, they vacation regularly, and they typically supervise people who are in a lower class than they are. And so that's another way that they, just like the wealthy, get to sort of reaffirm their class status, is what they're able to do in charge of others. Right? Now, average middles are generally less prestigious or less educated members of the middle class. So they may work in retail, in the management aspects of it. They may be general social workers as well as teachers in K through 12, carpenters, bus and truck drivers. So the work that they do, and that's just a range, not the entirety, but that's sort of giving you an idea of what they do. The work is steady, but it's more stressful. They don't have the same ways within which to sort of relieve stress. They will have time off, but it may not be as extensive as people in the upper middle class. They may not be able to work from home during the pandemic as readily as members of the upper middle class and the upper class. So that's where the stress may indeed be involved. There may be more repetition with respect to the work that they do, and so the repetition itself, that process can become, indeed, may involve some significant stressors that members of other classes or the upper middle class do not have to deal with. Typically, you're looking on an income range, you're looking typically at incomes from $45,000 a year to around $90,000 a year for a family of four. They typically, as average middle class people, will have more debt relative to their income than members who are of the upper middle class or the wealthy, right? They'll have health benefits, they'll have vacation time, but it won't be as robust. So the health benefits for those who are average middles might involve a higher deductible. Maybe the deductible is $5,000 a year, where you have to spend $5,000 a year before the health plan picks up everything else. And so that's sort of what that's all about. Now, regardless of whether we're talking about average middles or upper middles, here are the kinds of ways within which you can look at all middle class people, particularly in terms of family life and communal life. So education, education, education is sort of that operative word. They say that in real estate, that location, location, location matters, and that is the most important thing. But with middle class people, education, 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 that matters the most. It's the most significant aspect largely of middle class life. The best possible educational outcomes are readily sought by middle class people. So they're trying to get the best school district or the best private schooling that they can afford to live in or buy or purchase into. And so the idea is that you're going to cultivate your children's possibilities and growth. And so the sociologist Annette Lareau talked about that there's this concerted cultivation process amongst middle class people, middle class parents, that they directly and assertively expose their children to a variety of stimulating activities, be it drama, band, soccer, baseball, hockey, vacation experiences where they're not only going on vacation but they can learn something and make that a part of their educational experiences. So the idea is to involve and invest in your children in ways that they'll grow, in ways that they will maintain, that you'll be able to pass on middle class status, or perhaps they could even go into the upper class and wealthy. Right? So that's the idea that education really ultimately matters for middle class households and families. And so for a lot of average middles, this may involve completing one's degree or going on for a graduate degree, for instance, in ways to attain more money and to affirm one's middle class status. Now, keep in mind that middle class households have a much, much smaller amount of the nation's wealth, and they have a shakier grip on it. So even if you're looking at the upper middle class, if you're looking at top doctors, top lawyers, even there where they sort of skirt the edges of upper middle class and the wealthy, they don't have the ability to grasp onto or create as much wealth, obviously, as members of the upper class. Also, when we look at the average, I should say, look at the income that's generated every year in this country, the trillions of dollars that is, again, overwhelmingly, the wealthy have the greatest proportion of what the entire country's income actually is. And so, again, middle class folks can and often do have indeed nice lives, but at the same time, it pales in comparison to what the upper class has. And some say, well, of course that makes sense because they have all this wealth anyway. Then others say, well, really the middle class should get the chance, the opportunity to do dramatically better because they indeed are the ones that are ultimately supporting the economy through the purchases that they make. Now, geography, in terms of social geography of where middle class people live. So in mid and southeast Michigan and metro Detroit, if we're looking at mid-Michigan, you'll find middle-class households commonly in suburbs like Davison, Grand Blanc City, Grand Blanc Township, Swartz Creek, Flushing, and throughout Metro Detroit, you'll find middle-class people widely dispersed throughout Oakland, Wayne, Macomb counties, and those areas, as well as Washtenaw County. Now, the working class, and there's still some debate about whether the working class is bigger than the middle class, where the actual breakdowns are. A lot of it just does depend on who you ask. Some say that it's just slightly bigger than the true core middle class, but nevertheless, we're looking at within the 40th percentile, if you will, so to speak, of the entire country being working class. And so a lot of often what we hear working class referred to as by or within literature, in many cases the working class is referred to as the lower middle class, sort of that very true low entry point to middle class standing. So not poverty, but at the same time, certainly not the commodious comfort that you see amongst average middles and certainly upper middles. So you're looking at incomes between 25 grand and 45 grand a year for a household of 4 people. And again, you're looking at that household of 4 folks sharing that amount of income. So you're looking at the work being less stable, entry-level or even temporary jobs. This is a variety of different industries, really at the lower levels of those industries. So it could be manufacturing, education, retail, as well as in transportation. So often you'll see a lot of folks today driving for Uber Eats or DoorDash or Lyft or Uber. Those are good examples of where a working class kind of earning potential and opportunity may locate itself today. They're much more likely to wear a uniform when working, so to be blue collar or pink collar. And again, with pink collar, we're talking about those lower wage sort of entry-level positions that are disproportionately held by women that involve wearing a uniform. Working class workers are more vulnerable to downsizings, to being laid off, and to just struggle with life dilemmas. And so, I remember growing up, a lot of what would happen when we had vehicles that just could not stay fixed. They just could not stay in good repair. And that was one of the ways I learned a lot about how cars worked. Not because I was really curious about how cars work, but because, this part of the car is messed up, and that's what it's doing to the family this week or the next 2 weeks. That's why we have to walk here, that sort of thing. And so that becomes a much more common reality for working class people in a lot of respects. They're much more likely to be hourly workers instead of salaried workers. So when you're working class, often what happens is if you aren't at work or if you're not working for a few days, you're not able to get paid for what you missed. You don't have the ability to easily take time off and get paid while you're taking time off because you're sick or something of that sort, and vacation is often not consistent with hourly work. So that becomes the reality for a lot of members of the working class. A lot of these workers, per the COVID-19 pandemic, are often deemed essential workers, and so they have less ability to not only take time off, but they are less likely to have social distancing advantages while they're working. So they're less likely to be able to work at home and be socially distant from often the very public-oriented kinds of positions that they're working, especially if you're looking at, say, a retail environment or something like that. If you're a working class household, you're much more likely to have to maintain your living standards through debt, if you will, and through taking on credit card debt and other forms of borrowing in order to maintain a more comfortable standard of living that might come more easily for average middles as well as for the upper middles. All right. Now, along with the lower class, the earning potential and quality of life for the working class has been substantially reduced, severely hurt by deindustrialization. So how we've declined from manufacturing and we've shifted more to services and education. So we're much more of a service-based economy where people need high levels of education in order to attain good jobs and positions. And so in the past, working class households were supported, they were buoyed by unions and union jobs that paid really good wages. And so we don't have nearly the percentage of union pay and union wage jobs that we used to. And so that has really hurt the working class the most, along with the working poor. So life is more challenging, it's less predictable, it's more stressful compared to people who are middle and upper middle class and upper class. Marriage amongst the working class is far less stable, it's far less likely, and cohabiting and being a single parent is much more of a likely occurrence in a working class household. And again, this is not a moral question, this is a question of economic stability. So the economic instability of the working class experience tends to discourage marriage, and so that becomes the issue. And so research shows that often, of course, once folks move and transition away from poverty or from the working class into the middle class, they're much more likely to avail themselves of marriage because it becomes less of a liability. One of the more challenging things one can do is to marry while poor or marry while working class, because the economic stability is not there, and that bodes very, very troublesome for trying to attain and maintain a successful marriage. So that's one of the big challenges ultimately for marriage for working class people. Research shows that working class family members are more likely to stress a child's obedience to authority, to rules. They're less likely to challenge professionals that they or their children work and interact with, and they're less likely to aggressively promote activities and interests to their kids. And so sometimes for working class households, there can be incredible missed opportunities for growth and progression of children and from the family entirety. And so working class families, as you can imagine, possess very little of the nation's wealth. They're much more likely to stay working class and slide deeper into poverty. It's also the case, too, that for working class households, that some college, if any, is the likely college experience. Often you'll look at, within these populations, you'll find that some college, no degree, is a much more prevailing pattern for working class households. All right, now geography. So if we go back to that, if we think about that, the geographic distribution of working class households is sort of as follows. So in mid-Michigan, working class households are found throughout Genesee County, yet they're concentrated in the northern part of Genesee County, particularly along I-75 and 475. So communities like Burton, Clio, Genesee, and Montrose. And if we're looking at Metro Detroit and the Detroit suburbs, we're looking largely at areas like Warren, Hazel Park, Madison Heights, and downriver, so suburbs like Ecorse, River Rouge, and Flat Rock. Right. Now the lower class. We often think or talk about the lower class in terms of poverty or the poor. If we're looking at it and thinking about it outside of sociology, we often refer to the lower class, again, simply as the poor. There's a lot of debate about how many people actually are poor or impoverished. According to the census, roughly 12% of U.S. households live in poverty. However, many sociologists say that there's a better way to really account for this, whereas if we did so, poverty is probably closer to 20% of the U.S. population, or maybe even substantially more than that. In terms of income, these are households of 4 people on average who earn $25,000 a year or less. Poverty is ensured by these kinds of things. What makes poor folks poor? You're looking at the convergence of several factors. Lack of or no access to higher education. You're looking at little or no access to skilled labor. And you're looking at unstable employment in what we call the secondary labor market. And so these are jobs that are often in lower paying retail environments such as fast food, for instance. And so these jobs pay what we call subsistence wages. Subsistence wages. So they pay enough to allow you to buy food to eat and maybe pay a few bills, but they're not truly enough to support a family. They're not enough to have a car with insurance without working buku hours or something like that. So that becomes the real challenge there. You, for instance, again, might find somebody who works in one of these lower wage jobs that has to work 2 of them, or maybe has to find substantial overtime before they can truly be paid in a way that approaches a working class standard of living. And so again, just through the work process itself, you're looking at processes that ultimately conspire to keep people impoverished, right? The poorest of the poor, and again there are gradations and levels within poverty as well, the poorest of the poor are known as the underclass. These are individuals who often depend on government assistance to meet their basic needs. And so here we're talking about what we used to call welfare. Temporary assistance to needy families is what we call it today. They often cycle through state and federal systems like this that are meant to assist needy families. And this severe economic deprivation contributes to major life events and stressors that are overwhelming and that often keep poor folks and poor households from planning strategically for the future. So eviction is one of the big examples, and so the chapter has a good discussion of the research of sociologist Matt Desmond, looking really at eviction processes, and that eviction is much, much more a poor or working class woman's experience, according to the research of Matt Desmond. It's really, really unique in that respect. So it's unique from poor and working class men's experience, which often involves cycling in and out of lower paying or more dead-end jobs. And so eviction becomes often the difficulty that poor women and working class women face. Another good example of a stressor that poor folks may have that people in other classes don't, incredibly long commutes. And so somebody may have to commute through the MTA in and around Flint to get all the way to work in Troy, or all the way to work in Brighton, or some far-flung suburb like that. And so the very fact that our MTA in Flint goes to 5 unique counties is a good example of the social distancing, the social geography that is different for the poor and for the working class. And so that often becomes an issue, that there's a mismatch in terms of where poor folks live and where the jobs they work actually are. And so that becomes very stressful, not just in terms of how long it takes to get to work, but the fact that you're already earning a very low wage and you're spending a lot of that low wage paying for the very commute that you need to do the job. So those kinds of things, that sort of trap of that cycle, becomes very, very difficult to negotiate and to navigate for poor households and for poor people in particular. So as you can imagine, a lot of these things segregate poor people culturally and socially from the rest of the population. They're much more physically and geographically isolated than people of other classes, living in very different, unique kinds of neighborhoods and towns, often, again, like we said before about the wealthy, miles away and worlds apart. The actions of government and how we create communities, how we zone, how we basically say, okay, this property can be used for this purpose, that purpose. So the zoning rules that we see in a lot of major cities, towns, townships, and so forth favor middle class and wealthy people in terms of preserving them having the best choices of where to live, where to enroll their kids in school, safest neighborhoods and communities, and so forth. And so impoverished people don't really have those options, so they are left to fend for themselves with what's left over in terms of the housing and residential choices that they can make from. Also, poor families are much more likely to be single-parented, and they're much more likely to be a single-parent household headed by a woman. And so we call this in sociology the feminization of poverty. Again, so poverty is disproportionately a woman's experience. And so if we're looking at single male households, they have substantially less likelihood of poverty than single female-headed households. We pay women less. Also, divorce and separation tend to depress a woman's earnings in the process of that. And then also births to single women. Those things tend to feminize poverty within our society. Geographically, if we're looking at mid-Michigan and Metro Detroit, poor households are concentrated in the following places. So in Genesee County, poor households are concentrated in the city of Flint, where roughly 40% of all residents of Flint are living in poverty. And the average income is consequently around $25,000 a year. And if we're looking at Genesee County in general, you'll find that poor families are and poor households are somewhat dispersed throughout Genesee County. In Metro Detroit, poverty is found in Metro Detroit, I should say. Poverty is commonly found in the city of Detroit. So the data show that Detroit is the second poorest big city in the country, at roughly 31% of all households in Detroit live in poverty. And you'll find poverty is also concentrated in Detroit's downriver suburbs, places like River Rouge, Flat Rock, as well as Ecorse.